I'm happy to take questions.
Just on the debt, Minister, we see that going to 17.4% all the way out to 2023. And notably, as you said, that is a year after the budget responsibility rules finish, I guess. Is this an indication from you today that you're going to continue on those rules?
No, we've always said that the rules are set for this term of government. And we obviously, when the new government comes together after the 2020 election, I very much hope to be part of it, and we'll be part of those discussions. What that's not to signal is any approach that doesn't take into account the importance of New Zealand keeping relatively low levels of debt. But in terms of the forecast today, all this does is project out what would happen if we stuck with the current fiscal settings.
So that could change that?
I beg your pardon?
That could change that 17.5?
I imagine as we get closer to that point in time, inevitably it would change, but what I'm saying is that the 20% target was one for the 21-22 year. These show that we'll meet it.
Are you confident that you've got enough data to be able to measure well-being in a concrete way?
We need better data. We've got enough to be able to start that process. But as you would have seen from the presentation that I've just given, we're obviously replete with data about the economic and fiscal situation because that's what we've traditionally measured. We do have good data in some areas of the other capitals. For example, things like educational attainment and home ownership and that sort of issue. Where we don't is perhaps in some of the natural capital areas where we struggle a bit to get all of that data around what we understand about child well-being in particular, cultural well-being. So these are the things that we need to build up over time. But I think we've got enough to be able to make the decisions we've made in this budget, but that will be a focus for us over the coming years. Sorry, I'll just take Jess's follow-up on that.
What do you say to people when they be sitting at home looking at these well-being measures and saying they look a bit fluffy?
No, I don't agree with that. I think these are actually the measures that people think about in their daily lives. They're concerned about the mental and physical health of their friends and their family. They want there to be communities in which they feel safe and secure. So I think these are actually the very issues that New Zealanders care about. Of course, we all care about having a strong economy to enable us to have choices, and we continue to measure that here. But if we only measure our success on the basis of GDP growth, then we run the risk of having far too many people fall out and fall behind. We've seen high levels of GDP growth in recent years, but other social indicators and statistics that New Zealanders are not proud of. I think this approach gives us a much fuller picture of our success as a country.
Minister, what is the opportunity cost of the 5 priorities that you outlined?
The opportunity cost.
I mean, if spending is being prioritised in these 5 areas, what's going to go to...
Yeah, I mean, this has been the case for every single budget since time began, that you will always have choices to make. By making these choices, we are investing in the areas where we think we'll get the greatest long-term payoff intergenerationally. As I said at the start, there's a core set of expenditure in any budget that's unavoidable, and that still happens. And we still have the baseline spending that's already allocated, up over $80 billion. What this is about is where do we invest the next dollar to get the best outcome long term for New Zealand. So obviously there'll be areas that won't get as much focus this year, but these are the ones that we've assessed as having the greatest long term impact.
You used housing as an example, the difference between output and outcomes, or interest in outcomes. Does that mean you're less fixated on 100,000 affordable homes in 10 years, or?
I mean, that's an important policy and an important thing that we put forward. What I'm interested in is making sure that all New Zealanders have access to shelter, that they're warm and dry and safe in their homes. The Kiwi Build target doesn't change as a result of this. I'm interested in the outcomes we achieve through building those houses, not just those houses either. We've made a commitment to build 1,600 more social houses over the next 4 years. We've got a strong commitment around transitional housing, emergency housing. All of those matter, and they're critical to achieving the outcomes that I've mentioned. So we can still have output-based targets. What I'm focused on for this budget and these priorities are the outcomes we achieve through those targets.
Do you think you can increase the well-being in the long run at your target with the current budget settings that we have?
I believe that we can make significant progress towards that. It remains a balance. Well-being requires us to have long-term, strong accounts. We can't make the decisions we want to make. We can't make the choices we want to make if we're not able to withstand whatever global shocks might occur. So I'm confident we can continue to get the balance right. I think, as I've said before, clearly as we start to take different approaches to the budget, when we come to set our fiscal rules for next time, we'll take into account the fact that this is now a well-being budget, and you'd expect me to have well-being budget responsibility rules, but I remain committed to the ones that we have. They're the ones we've signed up to, and I think we can get the balance right.
So what could those well-being budgets?
Oh, that's for another day, Bernard.
The health capital pressure has changed. It says no hospital assets are rated poor or very poor condition. I think that's from the Treasury investment statement earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
But the DHBs have put in their capital intentions, which are only
1.4.
1.4, which is 10%.
Yeah.
That 19% equates to 14 billion new spending over 10 years. Why are they only up to 10%?
14 billion over 10 years is exactly the envelope of spending that the DHBs have identified.
Yeah.
But I want to add, we haven't made the decisions yet on the final health capital envelope for next year. They're not included in here. That's merely the DHB's capital injection intentions. So we're still to make that decision. If you remember, in last year's budget we put in $750 million in health capital. It had been 150 before that. We're still in the process of working out exactly what that number will be.
It's still only, what they've asked for is still only 10% over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
10% of what they need over 10 years.
Yeah.
And 5 years.
Yeah, no, and as I say, we haven't finalised our decisions yet on what we'll put into health capital. That's merely their assessments. And I'll just add to that, one of the issues around health capital, as indeed it is around a number of other areas, is capacity. Because the actual ability to undertake the projects and the work and get them done remains limited. And it is one of the issues we've got in DHBs, as we do in a number of other areas. Sorry, Henry?
Given capacity, and also given that the growth softening seems to mostly be from migration forward, is there any kind of plan to maybe try to turn that around, or is it useful because it will be infrastructure?
Well, the important thing is getting the mix of immigration right and making sure that we are bringing in the skilled staff that we need. We acknowledge, and we've always acknowledged, that there will need to be continued inward migration to New Zealand to fill skill gaps. We've made some policy changes to get that mix right. The forecast is for it to drop off. As ever, the Treasury and I will have an ongoing dialogue about just how quickly that drop-off will occur. They forecast for it to get down to 25,000 by the end of the forecast period. That's better than when it used to be 15,000. So we'll see whether those forecasts actually play out that way. Historically, they haven't, but it's a fair measure. So we just have to make sure we get the right mix in, as well as training New Zealanders, and that is one of the main priorities for the government in the education and skills area, is ensuring we are able to give more people more options and fill those gaps.
Is that 25,000 too low?
Look, it's a projection, and look, we have policy settings, we're not setting targets, and we made that very clear on coming into government. People made estimates of what the impact of those targets would be. We are where we are at the moment, in the low 60,000s in terms of net inward migration. The forecaster is for it to drop off. We'll see if that happens.
Do you think that will contribute to wage growth by having such a tight labour market?
Well, the forecasts indeed factor that in, that is a factor for wage growth. Wage growth is forecast at around 3%. I believe that's a sustainable level, but it is impacted on by the tight labour market for sure. Brian?
You mentioned the global risks to all of these forecasts. Which are particularly front of mind for you?
Oh, look, I think I continue, as I think most people do, to keep a wary eye on the China-US trade dispute, despite the impressions of some agreement a few weeks ago. That's continued to cause tension and does continue to cause tension. The US economy itself and how further fiscal tightening monetary policy tightening rather, will affect the way the US economy grows. Obviously there's concerns in China, even though they're coming off very high levels of growth. If that pops down even a small amount for New Zealand, that has some impact. And then broader instability. I'll resist commenting too much on the UK and Brexit situation, but clearly in Europe there are concerns about that and other concerns as well. So all of those factors weigh on our mind, and as I said, I had a look at the speeches given by the IMF leaders this week, and they indicate that they have some pessimism about a global downturn. I'm not yet ready to say that that's going to happen, but New Zealand needs to be prepared for it, and I believe we are well prepared for it. We are resilient. We have the capacity in the economic settings that we have to be able to respond to those international trends.
So if there was a downturn, would you look at fiscal stimulus, or would you look at tightening the belt?
We'll make that decision when we get there, but as we've said all along in terms of your favourite topic on the budget responsibility rules, that we would be prepared to, if we are facing that kind of crisis, we have to be prepared to relax those. So I don't believe we are facing that kind of crisis at the moment, but we've always said from the day we put them in place, in response to a major economic shock, we would have to react.
Do you think preparing for those for that scenario might involve giving into the Reserve Bank's request for extra staffing and its
Nice segue, Thomas. Look, we'll consider the Reserve Bank's bid for extra staffing alongside other budget bids. Where's Jason? I'll just get the not in today. They are not unlike other agencies where everybody is asking for more resources and more capacity. I respect what the Reserve Bank Governor has said about that regulatory role and the importance of it, increasing importance of it, and so we'll take that into account in future bids. I also need to say that phase 2 of the Reserve Bank review is about these issues, and so once we establish exactly how we're going to organise ourselves around financial regulation, that will obviously have an impact on where we might put resources in terms of staffing. I would note that if they are the number of staff short, that didn't happen in the last year.
Minister, just to pivot to Kiwibuild quickly, how confident is the government that it can deliver on the program, given not only the capacity constraints that has been identified throughout the sector, you've also got construction companies, some of which have fallen, but more importantly on the demand side, you haven't got all the pre-registered bidders that you might have. How confident can the government be that it's going to deliver?
Oh, look, these are ambitious targets. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I'd rather be ambitious than sort of somehow or other accept defeat that we can't build affordable homes. We can. We've just got to marshal the resources of the public and private sector to do that. So I remain confident that we will meet the targets that we've set. Minister Twyford has got a range of different plans underway to ensure that we do. And in the end, the overall goal of building more affordable housing is essential. Yes, there are capacity constraints, but as you see, residential investment here is forecast to increase significantly. This is an area where I think companies want to be. The issues you're raising are more in the vertical construction industry and the large-scale commercial buildings, and obviously we've sat down with people in that sector to ensure that we don't see those kinds of collapses happen again. So no, I remain optimistic, but clearly there are certain constraints that we need to get through.
Even with that though, is it that you can actually find the right people in the right places for the right homes, or are those settings still possibly not at the right scale?
Oh, look, I think they are. We have the ability to reassess them if we don't think that they are, but Kiwibuild doesn't rely on there being an excess number of people in a given ballot. The ballot was simply a way of being able to control the process, but we continue to believe that there's an important role for us to ensure that affordable housing is being built. The target areas are based on where we know that there is a shortage of affordable housing, and I still believe that's an important thing for us to do.
Given house price inflation has actually leveled off somewhat, while rent inflation continues apace, but the government's mostly still focused on building homes that the middle class people would buy, is there any thinking that you can maybe switch that over to social housing perhaps? Some of that $2 billion.
We're still absolutely committed to social housing being built, and we've got an ambitious program to do that. I mean, if you argue the capacity constraint argument, that affects both sides of that building, which whether it's for social housing or whether it's for affordable housing to buy. But we will continue to invest in both sides of that equation.
So you're arguing for outcomes. What outcome do you want out of it?
One of the outcomes, I want a number of outcomes in housing, and one of those outcomes is that more New Zealanders own their own home.
One of the risks identified is actually in housing is that some of the Kiwibuild buying off the planes underwriting might be triggered. So so you purchase the houses off the developers, that could be an opportunity to actually, get some more state houses by stealth, right? If few bills,
Minister Twyford has a lot of plans. I haven't heard that one yet, though.
But you think you're going to have to tip more money in? Because that's what,
Into
Kiwi Bill. That's what Treasury Thomas's question's about. I mean, they're saying this will affect capital recycling of house prices. Are you going to have to put more money in?
I don't believe so at all. In fact, the Treasury's assessment remains unchanged about the scale and the pace of Treasury of Kiwi Bill. So,
What about the fiscal costs?
well, the fiscal cost, the $2 billion remains the envelope. Treasury have now got more accurate understandings of how that works from their discussions with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development. So at this stage, the $2 billion I think will be enough to create the houses that we've said we'll build.
Do you think you'll have to increase that rolling capital envelope from 30.1 billion in the upcoming budget?
We haven't made that decision, but clearly, as I said earlier, as we look at the budget bids as they come in and assess what's needed, that's one of the questions we'll have to answer.
Because you do have some room in that debt track to do it.
Yes, that's entirely true. Where there is some room in that debt track, but as I said earlier, I don't think at this point in the financial year, given the international volatility we've just been discussing, it would be responsible for me to make those calls at this time. But we'll take a look at the fiscal outlook and the needs that are there and make our final decisions in May.
How big is the risk that, like last year, some of the spending had to be moved forward to this year? Unemployment there or thereabouts at 4%. Is there not an ongoing risk that you'll actually struggle to get some of the programs away because there's just not the capacity in the economy to do it?
I mean, capacity constraints are an issue for the economy as a whole, and labour supply being a critical one of those. So we always have to keep that in mind, but we'll continue to, fund the programs that we believe need to be undertaken. From time to time, things happen that mean that expenditure rolls forward from one year to the next. That's the reality we faced. It's why the two Obergale surpluses together are about the same, but slightly different in each year. Will that happen next year? That'll depend on how we go in terms of capacity.
Had the problems around the census contributed to frustrations developing both the wellbeing framework, capital framework, and this budget itself?
Not specifically, no. Clearly, we all want to make sure we've got the best possible data available to us. And I've spoken with Minister Shaw about making sure that we work with Statistics New Zealand and other agencies to get the best possible data available to those who are making decisions or making proposals in the budget. Bear in mind, in any year that's not a census year, you are always using other data to supplement census data, so it's not unusual to have that situation, but we'll continue to work with Stats New Zealand and with the Treasury to make sure that we have the best available data, but it hasn't affected the framework, the wellbeing framework particularly, as obviously we were preparing that before. We would have had the census data anyway.
Will the government be a monetary policy mate that over the next year or two there is that downturn?
I'll always make sure that fiscal policy is playing its role and making sure that the economy works well. The forecasts in here are for inflation to stay around the midpoint, 2% point, and that expectation, I think, is borne out. It's interesting that the inflation, or the expectations of all of the forecasts, are around a $60 a barrel for West Texas crude, and you could probably buy that today, burn it for 52 if you wanted. So, there is potential for those inflation numbers to not quite play out, but that's where they're forecast for now. But obviously, we're very well aware of the importance of fiscal and monetary policy working together.
So why are you running a contraction rate
Well, the fiscal impulse over this period doesn't yet take into account other decisions that we haven't made yet. It is also part of the expenditure that's in this year coming forward from last year, so that makes a difference to how 2018-19 will turn out, and obviously we'll see where we get to in terms of further information about expenditure and the tax revenue we get, and that those impulses obviously will change if we make different decisions.